You'd think living well costs money, especially in 2025, but what if you could spend less and still have more? Not more material possessions, but more time, more connection, more peace. That's the norm here in France. How do the French live so frugally and somehow still live better? The cost of living in France is a lot lower than in the US or the UK. For example, my rent is €850 for a one-bedroom, 42 meters squared apartment with a nice balcony. It's in the outskirts of Lyon, in a nice area, in a gated residence, so it's pretty secure, and when you're splitting the rent between two of you, it's an absolute bargain. Especially when you look at London, for example, where rents are extremely high. People are paying over double, if not triple, for a one bed in a nice area. So €850, which is about £730 or $940 is very cheap compared to other major cities such as London or New York. My electricity bill is also very cheap. It's €83 per month. My house insurance is only €11 per month. I know in the US people are paying hundreds of dollars a month for house insurance. I spend the equivalent of €80 per week on food shopping. That's about €320 a month. I'd say it's about the same in the UK, but I know in the US food shopping or grocery shopping is a lot more expensive. And finally, France is known for very cheap public transport. For example, in Lyon, you can get a transport card that gives you unlimited journeys in the month for only €25 a month if you are under 25, or if you are 26 and above, it's about €72 per month. But this is actually so cheap considering that you can use any metro, any bus, any tramway, an unlimited amount of times during the month. And on top of that, employers usually pay 50 to 75% of your transport costs, so it actually only ends up costing you around €25–30 a month, and even cheaper if you're 25 and under. People living in major cities in France therefore use public transport a lot more often than their car because it's so affordable and sometimes cheaper than paying for petrol in your car. So as you will have seen by the numbers, the standard of living in France is higher than in some other developed countries where rent and food prices are out of control. In France, you don't have to be rich to live a relatively comfortable life because the everyday essentials such as housing, food and electricity are kept at a reasonable cost. For example, rents are controlled by the government, so landlords can't charge over a certain price per square meter, and this prevents rents becoming unaffordable and ultimately entering into a bidding war where it's whoever has the most money gets the apartment, and that's unfortunately what's happened in London because landlords can just charge what they like. Because France has got a system designed to keep everyday basic living costs affordable, people don't actually need a big salary in order to live a fairly nice life. The spending habits of the French are also very different to other cultures such as in the UK. For example, takeaway coffee or getting a coffee on your way to work is nowhere near as popular as it is in the UK or the US. People tend to drink coffee at home or at work, but not necessarily in a takeaway cup on their commute, for example. There's also less of a culture of people buying lunch from cafes at lunchtime or ordering food. For example, I work in a school and most teachers bring their own lunch and it's home cooked food. It's not shop bought sandwiches or food that they've just gone out and bought quickly from a cafe across the street. They actually bring home cooked food. It's usually the leftovers of their dinner from the night before. But this really does keep spending down, especially as coffee and lunch prices in big cities now is just really, really expensive. Because there's less of an on-the-go food culture in France, people end up actually spending less money. France is obviously known for its really, really good food, and there's so many great restaurants at affordable prices. They often offer these things called a menu, and it's basically where you get a starter, main and a dessert for a set price. Here in Lyon, there's so many good restaurants that offer these menus for around €26. Of course, there's some that are more expensive, but I've been to one that was €26 and the food was really, really good quality. In the UK, for example, I've never seen a restaurant offer a starter, main and dessert for under £25. You just don't see it. These menus are even cheaper at lunchtime, so you can have a starter, main and dessert for about €15. Obviously in Paris, I think the prices might be slightly higher, but still it's relatively affordable for such good quality food. One of the major differences between France and the US is there's no tipping culture. The price you see on the menu is the price you pay, and waiters and waitresses are paid a full-time salary, so there isn't this expectation to tip as there is in the US. London has also got really bad for adding on service charges to bills. It's really great in France that they don't have this problem. Another big difference with French culture is that on Sundays everything is closed, and so therefore people are spending so much less money. Restaurants and cinemas are open, but most things like shops are not open, and so therefore Sundays are usually for spending time with family and friends rather than just spending lots of money because you're bored on the weekend. There's also more of a culture in France of people living within their means compared to other countries. Hardly anyone has a credit card, which I found really strange coming from a country where credit cards cards are so common. Buy now, pay later schemes are hardly used. They're not advertised anywhere near as much as in the UK and the US, where I feel like buy now, pay later is just pushed down your throat at any opportunity to get you to spend money that you basically don't have. And through using their debit card, when French people don't have the money to buy something, they just simply don't buy it rather than putting themselves in debt. Also, wealth is faked a lot less in France than in other countries. For example, designer bags are a lot less common, and if you see a woman with a designer handbag, then you know that she is very rich. Same goes for flashy cars. In the UK and the US, people have got flashy cars on finance just to keep up this rich appearance when they're not actually rich. Whereas in France, it's a lot less common to see expensive luxury cars, but if you see people driving around in them, it's because they actually have a lot of money. This is also the case for technology, and something that really surprised me when I first arrived in France is that hardly anyone has the latest iPhone. Most people have got older generation iPhones or just cheaper Android phones, for example, which is so different to places like the UK and the US, where there is this culture of having the latest iPhone, having the latest gadgets and keeping up with the trends. And finally, expensive beauty procedures are nowhere near as popular in France as they are in other Western countries. For example, hardly any French women have lip filler or acrylic nails. There is just more emphasis on natural beauty in France. There's less of this culture of spending your money to maintain fake beauty. So without the pressure to appear rich or keep up with the latest beauty or technology trends, there's more room to concentrate on the things that matter. For example, French culture puts more of an emphasis of making memories and spending time with family and friends. And because of that, people don't feel the need to overconsume on materialistic items that don't actually matter. And unlike the UK and the US, there's actually this reverse culture in France where people are looked down upon if they flash their money too much. If you're seen to be showing off your wealth distastefully or just a little bit too much around people that have less money, that's actually seen very badly. It's not seen as a source of inspiration. It's more seen as you haven't got as much consideration for other people who are less fortunate than you, and you just look really fake and materialistic, because that is not what French people care about at heart. Because French people earn lower salaries, DIY home improvements are usually done by people themselves. There's a lot less outsourcing for things like gardening and redecoration. People usually learn how to do it themselves, which is not a bad thing, because then people have a lot more DIY skills than in other countries where it's more common to pay someone to do the work for you. French homes are also a lot smaller than homes in the US. Therefore, walk-in closets are really hard to come by. Hardly anyone has one. And so space for clothes is very limited. And as a consequence, French women don't have thousands and thousands of clothes that they don't wear. There's also more of a consideration for the environment, more of a sustainable mindset, which is slowly coming to the UK as well, but from what I've seen is not yet part of the US culture. People prioritize secondhand and buying off of vintage because it's not only better for the environment and creates less waste, but also it's so much cheaper. You can get really good quality clothes, branded clothes, clothes that have hardly been worn for a lot less money. And if French women do decide to splurge and spend a bit more money on expensive brands, it's usually timeless classic pieces that are not going to go out of fashion, that they can wear for a really long time. There's less of a culture of jumping on trends and buying outfits that are in fashion this year but will be out of fashion next year. There's more of an emphasis on classic, classy, timeless pieces. Tumble dryers are also really uncommon in France. Most apartments, for example, my apartment doesn't have a tumble dryer, and although that's okay in the summer when it gets really hot and the clothes dry in a day, but in the winter it can be quite problematic. However, tumble dryers also use a lot of electricity and cost a lot of money to run, and so they're just not as common in French homes. An interesting thing I noticed when moving to France is that celebrations are a lot more low-key. Holidays like Easter and Christmas, there is much more of a focus on the food and spending time with family than presents, showering people with gifts, and all the commercial things that come with Christmas in the UK and the US. I definitely noticed in France around Christmas time that there were a lot less decorations in the shops. People also don't decorate their houses in the same way as they do in the UK and the US. It's just a less commercialized holiday in general, as Christmas time for French people is all about spending time with the people you love and enjoying good food. It's not really about the presents. People maybe give 2 or 3 presents per family member, but there's just not this overconsumption, giving their kids like 20 presents each. Same goes for birthdays. Birthdays are a lot less extravagant. People don't do big flashy birthday parties. Children Children don't really get gifted expensive gifts in the same way, because that's not what's important to French people. The importance is celebrating your birthday with a few friends and family that you love, with some good food and maybe a nice activity. There's just no need to rent out a room for 300 people with lots of alcohol, or even go on trips. I know in the US it can be common for some people to go on trips for their birthday, and that would just be unthinkable in France. They just don't have the money for that. And don't get me wrong, French people celebrate their birthdays and Christmas just as much as other countries. There's just more of a focus on meaningful connection and time spent with loved ones, rather than over-consuming and spending lots of money on materialistic things such as gifts that don't actually hold any sentimental value. So as I said, salaries are lower, but that's because although people in France have less money, they have access to good quality higher education for free. Government universities are free or cost very little, maybe like 300 euros a year. And that's just mind-blowing when you compare to the UK or the US, where university fees are just outrageously expensive. Although free universities does have its downsides, it ultimately means that less well-off people can go to university and have access to good quality higher education, which is certainly not the case in the US, where it's very difficult to go to university if you haven't got the money to pay the fees. A major difference between France and the UK and the US is the affordability of childcare. In France, school is mandatory from the age of 3, and children go to preschool from the ages of 3 to 6. Preschools are attached to primary schools, and they have teachers that are just as qualified as primary teachers. They also have assistants that are highly trained, and school usually runs from 8:30 to 4:30, with after school club after the day ends if needed. And this is all free and enables parents to go back to work without paying the exorbitant childcare costs you find in the UK or the US. In the UK specifically, childcare seems to have turned into a business where nurseries are charging parents an absolute fortune, and for many people it's actually becoming cheaper to stay at home with their children than to send them to preschool, especially as preschool in the UK is not full-time hours, yet costs so much money. French people also don't have to pay a massive price for good health. France has one of the best healthcare systems in the world. It's partially privatized, partially funded by the government. So some of the healthcare costs are covered by the government, and the rest you take out what is called a mutuelle, and this is a type of insurance that's nowhere near as expensive as health insurance in the US and actually pays when they're supposed to. And some of this is usually covered by your employer, so you usually only end up having to spend 30 euros a month for really good healthcare. Now in the UK, healthcare is actually free, but waiting times are now years rather than months if you want to see something like a dermatologist. And unfortunately, it's becoming like the US, where the people who have got money to pay privately are the ones that are getting good healthcare, and people who don't have money are suffering. So that's where it's different in France. If you're on a low income, the government covers you 100% for your healthcare, so you don't have to worry about getting insurance if you can't afford it, even though French healthcare insurance is really affordable. In France, there's a lot more support for individuals on a low income. Their benefit system is quite comprehensive, and people who are on unemployment, disability benefit, housing benefit get a lot more money than in the UK or the US. If you can't afford private rents, it's also easier to get social housing as well. In France, hustle culture is not really a thing. There's less pressure to climb the corporate ladder. It doesn't give you the same status as it does in the UK and the US. People just don't really care about things like that. The time they spend with their friends and family outside work is so much more important than the time they spend inside work. And so for that reason, French people have more vacation days. That kind of makes up for the lower salaries. There's also more bank holidays, and people actually use this time to go on holiday. Not on big, expensive, all-inclusive holidays abroad, but to the south of France, where you have really good weather, some lovely beaches and lovely scenery, and it doesn't cost the earth. For example, my boyfriend has 34 vacation days a year, and I work in schools, so I get the school holidays, which are a lot longer than in state schools in the UK. Being frugal in France is not just a personal lifestyle choice. It's actually based on a system that supports people's basic needs, so they don't have to worry about affording housing or healthcare, especially in this economy. More importance is placed on work-life balance, so that you have the time to spend with the people that you care about. People in France are less career-driven because that isn't what is important important to them. When you look at the French lifestyle, it's not just about minimalism for the aesthetic. We've seen recently with this phenomenon on TikTok of underconsumption core, suddenly people are promoting underconsumption when actually, worryingly, the underconsumption core should just be the norm. And people have been over-consuming for so many years that they've actually forgotten what a reasonable, normal consumption lifestyle looks like. There really is a big cultural difference in France, where standard of living and enjoying a nice life is so much more important than overconsumption and keeping up with trends. The French have proven that you don't necessarily need to be rich to live a happy, fulfilling life. Work-life balance, beautiful scenery, nice food, and time spent with loved ones making memories is enough for French people. So if you think the answer to a better life is having more money, you're wrong. You just need to move to France. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it gave you a bit more of an insight into what it's really like to live in France and the differences in culture between France and the UK and the US, for example. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know any other videos you would like to see.